All right, so today's questions are from a couple people that I got off my Instagram. So if you guys have questions, you can go to Mike J. Dewar on Instagram there. If you're listening to this on the podcast, you can also go to the my YouTube channel and you can watch this with me and we can have a conversation. So that's youtube.com/J2Fit. But first question today is from Tanu Baba. I think I said that. And they ask, low bar versus high bar squatting for someone with bad knees. So squatting inherently is not bad for the knees, right? I think inherently the issue comes when people are squatting incorrectly, right, which we can get into, or if there's underlying issues, right? So if someone has a bad squat, right, it could be because their patterning is wrong, and it's not necessarily muscular or any traumatic injury, right? The other side of that is that they might actually have some sort of traumatic injury that if it hurts while squatting, it probably is hurting while doing other movements too, and that's something that we need to really understand first is what is the underlying cause of that pain in the squat, because your knee shouldn't hurt in a low bar squat, it shouldn't hurt in a lunge, it shouldn't hurt in a high bar squat, and it shouldn't hurt in a front squat, right? If there's one of those is sticking out, my first inkling is saying if your knee hurts in a high bar squat, but it doesn't hurt in a low bar squat, we need to see why that's happening, right? And when we see the inherent differences between the low bar and the high bar, so the high bar, it's defined as a high bar because the bar is higher on the back. By in turn, it keeps us in a more vertical position. So think about a bodybuilder attacking their quadriceps or a weightlifter training because they need to stay in a vertical position. So in doing so, by keeping the vertical position, we cut down on the amount of hip flexion that's needed, and in turn, we require higher degrees of knee flexion, which the quadricep extends the knee, which is why we have more developed quads typically when we high bar to a nice deep full range of motion in the knee flexion. Now, inversely, you have the low bar squat. And there's something that I want to clarify here. A lot of times people hear low bar squat and it's a squat, it's part of the same family. And while yes, the low bar squat, when you look at the angles, it's much more actually like a posterior chain dominant deadlift or a pull, right? Because just like in the deadlift, the hips are flexing at higher degrees, right? So we're loading up the hamstrings, the glutes, the back more. And the knees, while they are not straight, they are still flexed. Just like in the deadlift, we do have a bend in the knees. The low bar squat is much more of a posterior chain, and I would call it kind of in between that. It's not, I wouldn't call it an adequate quadricep developer movement. I'd call it, yes, it's a squatting movement, but if someone has bad knees and they can't high bar squat, but they can low bar squat, they're probably able to do that because their knees aren't bending a lot, right? But is that necessarily the right thing to do in that situation? Or should they maybe not be squatting at all in that instance and really work on repatterning proper knee flexion, right? Because we have to kind of let the joint actions and understanding anatomy guide our exercise selection, not say, I want to squat, my knee hurts in high bar, so I'm going to go to low bar. Because you haven't addressed the underlying issue of your shitty knee flexion. And the quadricep is probably not getting adequately trained, so you're just digging yourself in a deeper hole. So some things that I really like to think about here is and I have to assume here, because it's kind of an open-ended question, I have to assume that when posing this question, the high bar squat may be painful for someone. And if that's the case, we need to first dissect the anatomy and how the joints are moving. So if we look at certain movements like, do they have pain when they bend their knee sitting in a chair and they bend it from the full range of motion? If there's no pain and they can do that freely, then that at least tells me that there is no there's no joint damage, right? Can they sit there and do a split squat lunge and do it correctly without any pain? If that's the case, then I say, okay, like they have movement, right? They have some sense of stability. There is no structural damage like they have blue ligaments or their cartilage is out in their knee and they're having pain regardless of what they're doing. So you have to kind of backtrack from there. But then what we have to look at is, are they able to add load? So maybe squatting, the high bar squatting that they're doing with heavy weight, that's what's causing the issue. And they just don't have the ability to control that weight and to control the eccentric. So what's happening is the muscle isn't strong enough to handle that. So it's asking the bones, the connective tissues, the ligaments to do all that for it. And that's where you get the, because bones, ligaments, and connective tissues don't get adequate blood flow typically. They recover slowly, you get a lot of damage, and it can really sideline you. So if we can go through all those unilateral movements and say, hey, we're good, then I think it really comes down to you need to fix your patterning and you need to drop the loading. You need to employ certain techniques. So I like doing tempos, pauses in the deep stretch. I like doing lighter loads with that so you can have adequate control. You can also use like mini bands around the knees. Typically, if the knees, maybe you're collapsing in, it's called valgus. That could cause knee pain, a lot of lateral knee pain, because you're asking the lateral knee stabilizers and the ligaments to pick up because the glutes aren't doing their job. So we can use reactive neural training like the mini bands, where it's around your hips. I'm sure you've seen those now anywhere. You can do that and you can start to train the glutes and repattern. A lot of times I also like putting blocks underneath the heels and really forcing people to get into deep degrees of knee flexion while staying upright. And sometimes they just don't have the ability to do that yet. So you have to think about putting those blocks there to allow them to maintain that proper knee positioning, and then force them to pause at the bottom and really teach them how to use their quads. I also like using different machine-based stuff. So a leg press is sometimes great if we want to develop the quads. And let's say in a squat, I'm tired from a squat, right? I had a heavy squat day and my back might be a limiting factor at this point. My quads have more in them. You can use unilateral or you can use machines to just drive more muscle growth in the quads. And again, focusing on deep muscle stretch, deep range of motion, feeling the local muscle fatigue in the quad. If you're feeling it in your knees, in your ligaments, and you're sore, you're probably not controlling it enough. You're going too fast, you're using too much momentum, and it's probably just too heavy. So again, I don't know if I answered that, but there's a lot of information there. But again, one squat isn't necessarily worse or better for your knees. You have to understand why your knee is hurting in a certain squat and kind of backtrack from there. The next question, on a lighter note, but I'm kind of going on this as a note for nutrition. Ross Hicks asks, how many sweet potatoes could you realistically eat in one sitting? So, I think it's important first to clarify what type of sweet potato, like what form it's in, right? And I'm gonna kind of break down to three. You have its fullest form, which is the baked sweet potato, right? Whether it's the oven or the grill. You have the French fry, so it can be the French fried, but I actually like air fryer sweet potatoes. And then you have some sort of a mash. So when we look at that, if I was sitting there looking at potatoes and I said I have to eat for mass quantities, I personally would choose to do a mash. Why? Well, I don't have to chew it, so that's going to impact how much food I could eat at one setting because of the jaw muscles. And then also, I'll be able to maybe manipulate with the taste a little bit. So I like doing mash when I'm trying to bulk because I can eat it quicker. I don't have to chew it as much, and I can add some sugars or some oils, just something to get it more palatable, so I'm more apt to be eating it. And then I think it's important for like a bulking cycle to maybe look at mash because it's going to be much more easily digestible because your body, it's already kind of broken down. Your body doesn't need to digest all that, so it's not sitting in your gut for as long, which is big when you're trying to bulk. I think then if it was a regular potato form, like a baked potato or a cooked one, I think I'd have to have some sort of topping because, it's kind of plain and bland, and, eating the skin, it's going to take time. So that's definitely going to cut down my ability to eat as many. Which I guess if you're trying to like maintain weight or, you don't want to be eating a lot of sweet potatoes, but you want some satiety and some fullness, maybe that's an option instead of the mashed. Lastly, the French fries. So I've been doing a lot of air fryer, especially during my cut, because I cut them up, and you'd be surprised at how much area a cut up potato and french fries versus just having one potato, how much it fills your plate up, and which is cool is because you feel like you're eating so much more food. So I've been doing that with the air fryer. Obviously I'm not adding any, it's not fried, but it's an air fryer, so it's a healthy alternative, not a lot of fats. But you know, I don't think I could eat as much volume because my stack of french fries, because it's cut up versus my mashed, would be so much greater that it would almost be daunting. So it's great when I'm trying to tell myself or feel like I'm eating a lot when I cut things up. Or if you ever cut an apple up, it just goes a lot further on your plate, so you visually are thinking you're eating more. So that's kind of a trick I've used in cutting. But to answer the original question, if I had to eat as many potatoes as I could, right, and I was obviously not wanting to be bound up, it's a lot of roughage, a lot of fiber, I think I'd probably go and I could probably eat 2 to 3 mashed and comfortably leave that sitting feeling full but not wrecked. So yeah, I mean, comment below, guys, if you have any ideas of what you think, what you could eat. But you know, I'd probably mash it and maybe put a little bit of brown sugar in there, maybe a little bit of butter. I mean, at that point, if I'm eating 3 potatoes, I'm not worried about calories. So that would be that. All right, and then the last question comes from Eduardo Esco, and it's a question: how did you stay mobile for weightlifting while training bodybuilding? And I'm assuming that he saw a lot of my Instagram posts where I was doing a lot of more physique type work while I was during the COVID era and just working from home, and then obviously cutting, so really focus on physique. So I want to just preface this by saying bodybuilding, when I call bodybuilding, right, I think a lot of people just visualize a bodybuilder. They think big, huge bodybuilder, right? They think like super immobile and you know, just kind of a big hunk of meat. And when I look at that, I think about bodybuilding to me is really just interchangeable to movements that are going to build our body, muscle building, hypertrophy training, right? So whether you're an athlete, a weightlifter, powerlifter, or somebody out for physique, when I say bodybuilding, I personally mean we're doing movements that are attacking muscle hypertrophy, which is a characteristic of a training adaptation, and we're trying to increase the density, increase the muscle fiber size, and increase all of that to then set a foundation that maybe we can shift more into strength work or whatever we wanted to do. Now, bodybuilding is not inherently bad for mobility, right? There's a lot of weightlifters who weightlift and have shit mobility. There's a lot of powerlifters who powerlift and have bad mobility. There's a lot of runners who run and have really bad mobility. And there's a lot of bodybuilders who have beautiful mobility, right? So when people think that they put together in their head that bodybuilding inherently will, you know, like bench press is going to make your pecs tight and you won't be able to snatch overhead, I disagree with that. I think that if you do certain things in your training and then you're coming from a point where you're already starting with good mobility, you're not going to have limitations as long as you find proper balance. So how do we do that? First and foremost, and this is really bodybuilding 101, is you train in the full range of motion, right? We're trying to get, when we look at muscle hypertrophy, we're trying to get the muscle to fully extend and fully open. We're getting a lot of muscle loading and tension. So, you know, in a squat, we're full deep squatting, feeling the quads, we're feeling all of that. And I think that is going to help you in weightlifting because you're going to get stronger in the end range, right? You're going to load everything, but also you're going to start to learn to control these eccentric motions. So all of that is actually great for not only maintaining or restoring mobility, but then also being able to control those ranges of motions and having all of that. So I don't think that bodybuilding would hurt you in that sense. If anything, it would help because it's going to force you to really open and control yourself throughout the range of motion, which is exactly what I do with a lot of my weightlifters, is I force them to really slow the movements down, feel the muscle loading, feel the contraction, feel the stretch. Like I said before, controlling the eccentric. So the eccentric, if we look at a squat, it's a lengthening phase of the muscle, so the quads are eccentrically loading when we descend under control. In Olympic weightlifting, typically we don't want to go slow with that if we're trying to move mass weights because we want to be fast, we want to be explosive. But at certain times with lifters maybe who are lacking size or who lack coordination and control in the squat, or maybe have excessive knee pain because their muscles aren't taking on the loading, what do? I force them to squat slow, pause, tempos, all these things that you see all these coaches are now using, these tempo counts and these pauses and positional work. Bodybuilders have been doing that forever, right? To try and isolate certain muscle patterns and to try and really build their weak points in the physique and build those muscles up. And it's no different, except now, some people think about looking at bodybuilders as these just like immobile people. And while they are, it might not have been because bodybuilding made it. It's because they probably just didn't have mobility to begin, and they've always done bodybuilding and they never addressed their mobility. Just like, again, there's weightlifters who have really bad mobility who just continue to weightlift, and they think that weightlifting is going to be good for the mobility, but they're not getting better. So the exercise mode isn't necessarily going to be better or worse for mobility. It's really about how you're doing something and what you're coming into it as. And then lastly, while I was doing this, I still was training weightlifting. So typically I was training weightlifting before all this, probably 4 or 5 days a week. I'd end with some sort of bodybuilding-esque type of accessory work, maybe 1 to 2 exercises every day. In my off seasons or in times where I'm not, I'm further off competition, during this period I was only weightlifting 1 day a week, and I was only doing I was doing a power snatch plus a hang snatch, and then I was doing, I think, like a hang clean plus a jerk. And then I had a little bit of behind the neck push pressing with the snatch grip and push presses for shoulders. That was it, right? And I think, like, for me, knowing my, my troubled areas, so like typically the shoulders, right? And most guys probably get tight shoulders if they start doing a bunch of bench and stuff and curls. But if I just maintain that behind the neck stuff, doing my accessory work, my behind the neck presses, and doing some basic snatch work to kind of keep it fresh, I was fine because I already had the mobility going in. So I think that's important to designate. But again, I don't think that mobility is going to get worse if you do bodybuilding. If you do the bodybuilding movements in the 4 range of motion and you control the eccentric and you do it properly while also maintaining your skill sets, right? Which you'd be surprised at how little you have to do for weightlifting. If you're intermediate to advanced, you could get away with doing 1 to 2 days and then put all your other efforts into gaining muscle, gaining strength, and not be fatigued because you're doing snatches and cleans all day. But that's a whole here nor there kind of conversation, a whole nother topic there. So I think those are some things. I know I kind of beat around the bush, but I just want to make it clear again that bodybuilding is not inherently bad for mobility. I actually think it's probably helped me, especially with my squatting and my mobility down there, to really get comfortable pausing down to the bottom, feeling the muscles loaded. Same thing with RDLs and hamstrings, like stretching those hamstrings out has really helped not only build the hamstrings under load and tension, but also get me better in certain positions like the hang, where now my hamstrings are developed and they've understood that they need to open up and extend the hips at the top. So I actually recommend most people to maybe try some bodybuilding accessory work and use pauses and use tempos and 4 range of motion to help them out. So okay, I think we've killed that horse. I think that's all I have for today. I wanted to keep this one pretty short. Like I said, about 3 questions here. So you guys can always post questions. If you guys are listening to this on the podcast, head over to my social media. I'm most active there at Mike J. Dewar. You can ask me questions in my DMs or comment on posts. I read them all, and I'll kind of throw these in here in upcoming series. You guys should also go check out this video. It's now on YouTube, youtube.com/J2Fit. You guys can comment there, share it, let me know what you think, and we'll have more to come. But once again, guys, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you guys, if you're looking for any cool training gear, diet, nutrition, supplements, all that stuff, check out the show notes in the beginning of this show when we go over in the first couple of minutes how you can save some cash and get going on that. That's all I got. All right, have a good one.